When Mariana asked if we could have dinner at her parents' mansion that Saturday night, I hesitated. It wasn't the house that bothered me. It was her father. Richard Montgomery, a man who used money as armor, whose words were sharp not from intelligence, but from inherited power. The owner of the biggest construction company in New York, he had never truly accepted me. To him, I was just a small business dreamer, a penniless romantic trying to run my little design agency. Still, I said yes, for her. The ride to the ID on Upper East Side was silent. Mariana knew how uncomfortable these encounters made me. As the Uber driver navigated the tree-lined streets of the upscale neighborhood, I adjusted my sale-bought suit and held her hand a little tighter. I could feel the anxiety wrapping around me like a wet coat, heavy and cold against my skin. "He'll be on his best behavior tonight," she whispered when the car stopped in front of the imposing gate, hoping more than believing. The doorman already knew us and opened it without a word. The immaculate garden with its royal palms and rare orchids seemed to mock the simplicity of our rented apartment in Brooklyn. Mrs. Cecilia Montgomery, Mariana's mother, greeted us at the door with a forced smile and glasses of wine already poured. She always tried to compensate for her husband's coldness with excessive kindness, as if apologizing in advance for what was to come. "Carlos, so glad you could make it. Mariana looks beautiful, as always." Her words sounded rehearsed, as they did every other time. The mansion was a monument to ostentation. Pricey paintings on the walls, imported furniture, a marble staircase leading to the second floor. I knew this scene well. It was the perfect stage for my periodic humiliation. Richard was already seated at the head of the long dining table, sipping cognac with a look of superiority that was painfully familiar. "Ah, you finally made it," he commented without standing up, consulting the wristwatch that probably cost more than my car. "I thought public transit might have delayed you." Mariana squeezed my hand, silently pleading for me to ignore the provocation. We took our usual seats, she next to her father, I across from her, next to Mrs. Cecilia. The maid, Mrs. Zulmira, began serving the appetizer, grilled shrimp with a fine herb sauce. The dinner started politely, as always. The clinking of silver, cutlery, the false courtesies, the superficial conversation. They talked about golf, the stock market, the summer house in the Hamptons, and their upcoming trip to Portugal. I nodded, smiled when expected, and said little. I knew my place, or rather, I knew the place he wanted me to occupy. As we ate, the main course, a salmon with asparagus that I could barely taste, Richard conducted the conversation like a maestro, always highlighting his achievements, always placing an abyss between us. "The new development in the financial district is already 70% sold," he boasted to his wife as if I weren't there. "We closed the deal with that Portuguese group I told you about." I did my best to maintain my composure, focusing on my food and the few pleasantries I exchanged with Mrs. Cecilia. It was the same old play. He, the successful protagonist. Me, the dispensable extra who had the audacity to fall in love with his daughter. Dessert arrived, an elaborate red fruit pavlova, along with another bottle of imported red wine. Mariana tried to soften the mood, talking about her work as an architect and our plans to vacation in Florida next month. I smiled at her, admiring her attempt to build bridges where her father only wanted to build walls. "Vacation? With what money?" Richard interrupted, feigning surprise. "I thought you could barely afford the rent on that, what is it, apartment?" The acidity in his voice made Mrs. Cecilia shift uncomfortably in her chair. Mariana took a deep breath, the tension evident in her shoulders. And me, well, I just smiled politely and took a sip of wine, as I had done at every other dinner for the past 3 years. Not out of weakness, but out of love for Mariana. I didn't know yet that this night would be different from all the others. The wine kept flowing, and with it Richard's arrogance. With each glass he became more relaxed, more theatrical, more merciless. The conversation, as it always did after the second bottle, turned to money, his favorite topic. Stocks, investments, real estate acquisitions, all serving as a backdrop to highlight the distance between us. I heard that friend of yours, what's his name? The one with the long hair who draws logos. Raphael, I replied calmly. He's an art director, not just a guy who draws logos. Richard waved his hand in the air as if swatting an insignificant insect. That's the one. I heard his little agency close down. It was to be expected, wasn't it? This business of little drawings and advertising for small companies. It has no future. Raphael, my best friend since college, had been going through a rough patch recently, but he was far from bankrupt. It was just another one of the distorted facts Richard collected to use as ammunition. Actually, he's expanding into digital, focusing on user experience, I corrected politely. He just closed a contract with a promising startup. My father-in-law let out a laugh that was too loud, too artificial. Startup, the magic word for kids with no capital, isn't it? Everyone has a brilliant idea until the money runs out. Mrs. Cecilia tried to change the subject, commenting on the recent renovation of the sunroom, but Richard was just getting started. The cruel glint in his eyes told me the worst was yet to come. He swirled the glass between his fingers, observing the wine as if consulting a crystal ball, and then, with a twisted smile, turned directly to me. So, Carlos, he said, emphasizing my name as if it were a derogatory term, what's it like, being poor? The table fell silent. Even the maid who was clearing some plates froze for a moment. Mrs. Cecilia choked on her wine, and Mariana squeezed my thigh under the table, silently begging me to let it go. But the question hung in the air, sharp and humiliating. Richard, for heaven's sake, Mrs. Cecilia murmured, embarrassed. What? It's just a question, he defended himself, feigning innocence. I'm genuinely curious. I've never had to go through it, thank God and my father. I forced a smile, letting the silence stretch. 3 years of dinners like this had taught me that reacting was exactly what he wanted, to feed his ego with my indignation, to confirm his superiority with my weakness. Tell me, he continued, emboldened by the attention, what's it like to look at a menu and actually decide based on price? Mrs. Cecilia laughed nervously, maybe from discomfort, maybe from habit. Mariana stared intently at her own plate, her cheeks flushed with shame, not for me, but for her father. Or better yet, he went on, refilling his glass, what's it like to know that you can never give my daughter even half of what she's always had? This house, these trips, this lifestyle? She says she doesn't care. But let's be honest. Stop, Dad, Mariana interrupted, her voice trembling. Please. He held up his hands in false surrender. I'm just having a chat with my son-in-law. Can't we have a frank man-to-man conversation? At that moment, something inside me changed. Maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was the accumulation of 3 years of small humiliations. Or maybe it was simply the exhaustion of swallowing shame in the name of family peace. I looked at Richard, at the man who confused cruelty with intelligence, who thought that money gave him permission to degrade others. You know, Richard, I began, surprising everyone by interrupting his monologue. Being poor, as you say, has its advantages. He raised his eyebrows, intrigued by my unexpected response. Oh, really? Enlighten us with your proletarian wisdom. For example, I continued calmly, you learn the true value of things, not just the price. You learn that respect can't be bought, that character isn't inherited like money, and that some men can be very rich on the outside but completely bankrupt on the inside. Richard's smile wavered slightly. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially at his own table. Cheap philosophy, he retorted, but his voice no longer carried the same confidence. At the end of the day, philosophy doesn't pay the bills. And money doesn't buy happiness, I replied. Cliché, I know, but true. Look at us. I live in a simple apartment. I drive a used car. I work 10 hours a day. But I come home every night to a woman who loves me for who I am, not for what I have. I can sleep knowing that what I've achieved was through my own effort. I can look in the mirror without wondering if the people around me are there for who I am or for what I can give them. The atmosphere at the table had changed. Mrs. Cecilia seemed simultaneously horrified and fascinated. Mariana looked at me with a mixture of surprise and, was it pride? As for Richard, he tried to maintain his arrogant pose, but something in his eyes betrayed his insecurity. He wasn't used to having his script altered. "Nice speech," he said finally, trying to regain control. "But in the real world, my dear, money talks louder, and some of us speak the language of money better than others." I placed my napkin on the table and smiled, not with weakness but with calm and deliberate resolution. I had grown tired of swallowing insults disguised as jokes, of seeing Mariana torn between her love for her father and for me. It was time to change the rules of this game. I slowly set my fork down next to my plate, letting the silence settle. I looked directly at Richard, truly seeing him. A man who, despite all his money and influence, needed to belittle others to feel powerful. I smiled, not out of weakness, but with a tranquility that came from a decision already made. "Well," I said, keeping my voice steady, "what do you think about the fact that this poor man will no longer be funding your luxuries from now on?" Richard's smile disappeared instantly. The room froze. Mrs. Cecilia held her breath. Mariana stiffened beside me, and his face paled in a way I will never forget. The flush on his cheeks faded, his hand trembled slightly as he placed the Yao glass on the table. His eyes, once so self-assured, now searched mine, confused, suddenly insecure. I had hit something deeper than his pride. "What are you talking about?" he finally managed to articulate, his voice reduced to a hoarse whisper. Mrs. Cecilia looked from her husband to me, completely lost. Mariana squeezed my hand under the table, not to make me stop, but in a gesture that mixed surprise and support. "I'm talking about the monthly deposits to Montgomery Construction," I replied calmly. "About the loans that have been keeping your empire afloat for the last 8 months. About the capital injection that stopped you from declaring bankruptcy after that project in the financial district went wrong." Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. For the first time in all the years I had known him, he didn't know what to say. His entire posture crumbled. Not physically, but socially. It was like watching a fortress collapse, brick by brick. How would you know that?" he finally stammered, trying to regain some composure, but his voice still betrayed his shock. "Because I'm the anonymous investor," I revealed, keeping my voice low but clear. "The silent partner you've been so eager to meet. The one who made it a condition to remain in the background." Mariana gasped beside me. This I hadn't even shared with her. It was a truth I had kept guarded, protecting her from having to choose between her husband and her father. "Impossible," Richard protested weakly, but his eyes already showed he believed me. "You don't have that kind of resources." My insignificant design agency has experienced exponential growth over the past 2 years, I explained. That account with the German multinational I mentioned last year, and which you completely ignored, put us on the map. And I didn't need my father's name to get it. Then came others, bigger ones. I reinvested, diversified, took calculated risks. Richard looked like a man watching his world fall apart around him. All the arrogance, all the superiority had evaporated, leaving only a frightened, middle-aged man confronting the possibility of losing everything. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Why would you do that for me?" "I didn't do it for you," I answered honestly. "I did it for Mariana, because I knew how much it would destroy her to see her father lose everything. Because unlike what you think, I don't measure value in figures or status, because I believe family means something, even when it's difficult." Mrs. Cecilia began to cry silently. I don't know if it was from shame for her husband's behavior, from gratitude for my intervention, or simply from relief at finally understanding the mysterious source that had saved the family's assets. "But it ends today," I continued, my determination unshakable. "There will be no more transfers, no more bailouts. From now on, you'll have to support yourself with your own money, if there's any left." The silence that followed was so dense we could hear the ticking of the old clock in the hallway. No one moved. No one dared. Richard looked like a man who had seen his past sins reflected in a mirror for the first time. His bravado was shattered, his expression broken into something I never thought I would see: regret. Mariana looked at me astonished. Tears welled up in her eyes, not of betrayal, but of pride. For the first time I had spoken for myself. For us. Her hand found mine again, this time with admiration. I didn't know," her father whispered. His voice was fragile, distant, like someone speaking from the edge of a cliff. "Why would you help me after how I treated you?" "Because I loved your daughter," I replied, "and I still do. But I won't let that love be mistaken for weakness anymore." I stood up slowly, carefully pushing my chair back. Mariana did the same, her eyes never leaving mine. There was a new light in them, an admiration I had never seen before. "Let's go," I said to her softly. She nodded, picking up her purse. "You can't just—" Richard started, but his voice failed him. There was no authority in it, just the empty echo of a power that was never truly his. "I can," I replied simply. "And I have. The paperwork has been with your lawyer since yesterday. I was waiting for an appropriate moment to inform you. You provided the perfect occasion tonight." As we turned to leave, Mrs. Cecilia also stood up. She approached timidly and, to my surprise, hugged me briefly. "Thank you," she whispered just for me to hear, "for not letting him fall, even if he doesn't deserve it." I nodded in acknowledgement. There was no anger in me, only the quiet certainty of someone who had finally found their voice. As we walked to the door, I felt the weight of 3 years of silence dissipating from my shoulders. It wasn't just the end of my financial support, it was the end of my submission. I had reclaimed my dignity, not by shouting, but by choosing truth over politeness. And in doing so, I reminded a man that respect cannot be bought, but it can be lost in a single breath. What no one at that table knew, what no one but me and the construction company's accountant knew, was the extent of my involvement in Richard's business. We walked across the garden in silence, Mariana holding my arm as if she feared I might disappear at any moment. The lights of the mansion faded behind us as we waited for the Uber I had just requested. "Carlos," Mariana finally spoke, her voice a mix of admiration and confusion. "How can you be the anonymous investor in my dad's company? Why did you never tell me?" The night was mild, a typical New York spring. I looked up at the sky, finding few stars visible through the city's light pollution. "I didn't want to put you in an impossible position," I answered honestly. "If I told you, you'd be torn between keeping my secret and feeling like you were lying to your father. I wanted to spare you that dilemma." It all started 8 months ago when Richard faced the worst crisis of his career. The big development in the financial district, a luxury residential complex, had faced serious problems with the land. Soil contamination was discovered during excavations, halting construction and generating lawsuits from furious buyers. Montgomery, construction, which had always seemed invincible to the outside world, was on the verge of collapse. At the same time, my agency had just closed a multi-million-dollar contract with a German multinational. 3 years of hard work, sleepless nights, and calculated risks had finally paid off. We were not only in the black, but had substantial capital to invest. That's when Richard showed up at my office on a rainy Tuesday. I remember clearly how he seemed smaller without his usual impeccable suit. Without his arrogant posture, he was soaked, as if he had walked through the storm for hours before mustering the courage to come in. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice stripped of its usual confidence. "In private." I dismissed my team for lunch and offered him a towel and a coffee. He accepted both with trembling hands. "I'm bankrupt," he confessed after long minutes of silence. "Everything I built, Everything my father built before me is gone. He told me about the problems in the financial district, the lawsuits, how the banks were closing their doors to him, how competitors were already circling like vultures, ready to buy the construction company's assets for a song. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Because I have no one left," he admitted, the shame evident on his face. "All the friends I thought I had disappeared when they heard about my situation. I'm here because Mariana loves you, and if she sees something in you, maybe I've been wrong." That confession, so difficult for a man like him, must have cost more than any financial sum. I studied his face, aged by stress, the red eyes that avoided meeting mine. "What exactly are you asking for, Richard?" "A loan, an investment, anything," he replied, his voice almost inaudible. "I have no way to offer collateral right now, but if I can get through this crisis." I asked for details, balance sheets, projections. To my surprise, he had brought everything in a worn folder. I spent the entire afternoon analyzing the numbers while he waited, as anxious as a defendant awaiting sentencing. The situation was serious but not unrecoverable. With a strategic capital injection and some renegotiations, the construction company could get back on its feet. It was a risk, no doubt, but also an opportunity, not just financial, but human. "I'll help," I said finally, as night fell, with a few conditions. The relief on his face was instantaneous, as if he had been freed from an unbearable weight. "Anything," he promised hastily. "First condition. My name remains confidential. No one can know it's me, especially Mariana." He frowned, confused. "Why?" "Because I don't want this to affect my relationship with her, or with you. I want it to be a business transaction, nothing more." "And the other conditions?" he asked cautiously. "You're going to stop spending money as if there's no tomorrow. You're going to cut unnecessary luxuries. You're going to focus on saving the company, not on keeping up appearances." He nodded, albeit reluctantly. He knew he wasn't in a position to negotiate. "Lastly," I continued, "you're going to treat your employees with more respect. You're going to stop firing people to save a few bucks while keeping your helicopter and your yacht. You're going to take on the responsibility of a true leader." He hesitated for a moment, but eventually agreed. He was too desperate to refuse. The next day, I transferred the first installment through an investment company created specifically for this purpose. No one but me, the accountant, and Richard knew the money's true source. To the outside world, Montgomery Construction had attracted a mysterious foreign investor. For months, I followed the company's recovery from a distance. Richard kept his word, at least partially. He cut some expenses, renegotiated contracts, and found a solution for the contaminated land. The construction company began to slowly get back on its feet. But one thing didn't change: his behavior toward me. At family gatherings, he continued with the malicious jokes, with the poorly disguised contempt, as if he needed to compensate for his vulnerability with me by treating me even worse in public. I endured in silence, reminding myself that I was doing it for Mariana, not for him, for her peace, for her pride. I never wanted credit or gratitude, but that night he crossed a line I could no longer ignore. His disrespect had outlived my generosity. I knew something strange was going on. Mariana commented as we got into the Uber that had just arrived. My mom mentioned a mysterious investor, but I never imagined. I took her hand and kissed her fingers gently. I did what I thought was right, but now it's over. Your father will have to learn to support himself. The car drove off into the night, leaving behind the illuminated mansion and the man who, for the first time in his privileged life, would have to face the consequences of his actions. The ride back home was silent, but a different kind of silence from the one we experienced on the way there. It was a silence of processing, of internal reorganization. From time to time, Mariana squeezed my hand, as if checking that I was still there, real and tangible. Through the Uber window, New York paraded in lights and shadows, indifferent to the small earthquake we had left behind on the Upper East Side. "How did you manage to hide this from me for so long?" she finally asked, her voice low so the driver wouldn't hear our conversation. "It wasn't easy," I admitted. "I almost told you dozens of times, especially when your father was being particularly cruel." She nodded, staring at her own hands. "I can't imagine what's happening in that house right now." I could. The silence we had left at the table probably still lingered, dense as fog. You could hear the ticking of the old clock in the hallway, marking the seconds of a reality forever altered. When we arrived at our small but cozy apartment in Brooklyn, the atmosphere between us was still charged with unprocessed emotions. Mariana went straight to the balcony, her place of reflection. I made coffee for us, a simple routine that always calmed us down. The aroma filled our space, bringing a little normality back. I joined her on the balcony, handing her a steaming mug. Our view wasn't anything extraordinary, just buildings, antennas, and a patch of sky. But it was ours. "What's going to happen to him now?" Mariana asked, looking at the illuminated city. "To the company?" I shrugged. "It depends on him. The construction company is stabilized, it's no longer on the verge of bankruptcy. If he manages it responsibly, he can move forward without me. And if he can't? Then he'll have to sell, start over, maybe on a smaller scale." Mariana took a sip of coffee, thoughtful. Knowing my dad, I think he'd rather die than admit he needs to start over. At that exact moment, her phone rang. She looked at the screen, surprised to see her mother's name. She hesitated for a second before answering, putting it on speaker. "Mom, is everything okay?" Mrs. Cecilia's voice came through, trembling and low. "Mariana, your father, he's not doing well at all." "What happened?" Mariana asked, immediate worry in her. "First year after you left. He sat at the table for almost an hour without saying a word. Then he locked himself in the office. I'm worried. I've never seen him like this." I exchanged glances with Mariana. This wasn't what I wanted. I never wanted to destroy Richard, just to set boundaries. "Did he say anything?" Mariana asked. "Almost nothing. He just kept repeating, he was right. I think he was referring to Carlos." Mariana looked at me, a silent question in her eyes. I nodded. "Mom, we're on our way back," she said and hung up. 20 minutes later, we were back at the mansion. Mrs. Cecilia greeted us at the door, her face streaked with recent tears. She led us to the office door, which was closed and silent. "He won't open it for me," she explained. "He doesn't answer when I call." Mariana tried the doorknob, confirming it was locked. She knocked softly. "Dad? It's me, Mariana. Can we talk?" "Nothing. Just silence." She looked at me, uncertain. I approached the door and knocked once, firmly. "Richard, it's me, Carlos. We need to talk." After a few seconds, we heard the sound of a key turning. The door opened just enough for us to see. Richard's face unrecognizable. His eyes were red, his hair disheveled, his tie undone. He looked like he had aged 10 years in a few hours. "Just him," he said to Mariana, his voice hoarse. "I need to speak with your husband alone." Mariana hesitated, looking at me with concern. I squeezed her hand lightly. "It's okay. I'll be fine." She nodded, reluctant, and moved away with her mother. I entered the office and closed the door behind me. The room, normally immaculate, was in disarray. Papers were scattered on the floor, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the desk, family photos turned face down. Richard walked to the window and stood with his back to me, looking out at the illuminated garden. "Why did you come back?" he asked finally, without turning around. "Your wife called. She's worried about you." He let out a bitter laugh. "Cecilia always worries too much. I'm just reflecting." I sat in one of the leather armchairs, observing the man who had intimidated me for so long. Now hunched over, he seemed smaller, more fragile. You know, Carlos, he continued, still with his back to me, I spent my whole life believing that a man's worth was in the size of his bank account. That's how my father raised me. That's how I lived. He finally turned to me, his red eyes fixed on mine. And now I find out that the man I despised for 3 years, who I humiliated at my own table, was the one who saved everything I built. Why? Why would you do that for someone who only treated you with contempt? It was the question he had asked before, but now with a genuine vulnerability he had never shown. I already said, I did it. For Mariana. No, he shook his head. You could have let me sink and then saved Mariana from the consequences. You could have waited for me to beg on my knees. You could have demanded that I humiliate myself. Why didn't you? I thought for a moment, searching for the most honest answer. Because I'm not like you, Richard. I don't believe we need to belittle others to feel bigger. I don't believe someone's worth is in what they possess, but in what they are capable of giving. He walked to the desk, picked up the whiskey bottle, but didn't drink. He just stood looking at the amber liquid as if searching for answers in it. You know what the most ironic thing is? He asked with a sad smile. All my life I looked at men like you with contempt. Dreamers, idealists, people who valued things that couldn't be counted or weighed. And now I realized that I was the one who was empty. He put the bottle back on the table without drinking. I don't know how to look at my daughter after this. I don't know how to look at myself. I didn't come here to destroy you, Richard, I said calmly. I came to set boundaries, to show that respect isn't something you buy, but something you earn. He nodded slowly, absorbing my words. It's never too late to start over, I continued, to build relationships based on something more solid than money. Richard approached the armchair in front of me and sat down heavily. For the first time since I'd known him, there was no facade, no rehearsed posture, just a man confronting the emptiness he had created around himself. I don't know how, he admitted, his voice almost inaudible. I stood up, ready to leave. Start by apologizing to your daughter and to your wife. The rest comes with time. When I opened the door, Mariana and Mrs. Cecilia were waiting, in the hallway, anxiety evident on their faces. Richard appeared behind me, hesitant like a child. Daughter, he called, his voice choked with emotion. Can we talk? The conversation between Mariana and her father lasted for hours. Mrs. Cecilia and I waited in the living room, an awkward silence between us, broken only by the occasional clinking of the teacups she insisted on serving. From time to time we heard raised voices coming from the office, more hers than his, decades of resentment finally finding release. Has he always been like this? I finally asked Mrs. Cecilia, who was nervously adjusting the sofa cushions for the 3rd time. She sighed, sitting with her back very straight, as if she had been trained her whole life to maintain perfect posture, even in the most difficult moments. Not always, she replied, looking at a family portrait on the wall. When we first met, Richard was different. Ambitious, yes, but also kind, a dreamer. He wanted to prove to his father that he could be as successful as him, but in his own way. She paused, lost in memories. It was after his father died that something changed. It was as if Richard had inherited not only the company, but also all the insecurities, all the ghosts. He became obsessed with expanding, with accumulating, with appearing invulnerable. And in the process, he lost parts of himself. I nodded, understanding the man I had judged so harshly a little better. Not that it justified his behavior, but it cast a different light on it. And you? Why did you stay? The question escaped before I could stop it. Mrs. Cecilia didn't seem offended. On the contrary, she smiled with a resigned sadness. At first, for love. Then for Mariana. And then, she made a vague gesture with her hands, indicating the luxurious house around us. For comfort, I suppose. It's easy to get used to a comfortable prison. At that moment, the office door opened. Mariana came out first, her eyes red, but her expression serene. Richard followed her, looking simultaneously exhausted and relieved, like someone who had just gone through a painful but necessary surgery. "Is everything okay?" I asked, standing up to meet her. Mariana nodded, a small smile on the corner of her lips. "It will be." Richard remained a few steps behind her, as if he no longer knew what his place in that family was. When our eyes met, something unexpected happened. He slightly tilted his head, a minimal but unmistakable gesture of respect. "It's getting late," I commented, checking my watch. It was past midnight. "We should go." Mrs. Cecilia hurried to suggest we stay, that there were plenty of rooms, that it wasn't safe to go back at that hour. But both Mariana and I knew we needed space, the comfort of our small apartment, to process everything that had happened. "I'll call you tomorrow, Mom," Mariana promised, hugging her. As we were getting ready to leave, Richard took a hesitant step forward. "Carlos," he called, his voice still hoarse with emotion. "Can I speak with you for a moment? In private?" I exchanged glances with Mariana, who nodded slightly. We walked to the back balcony, an elegant space overlooking the illuminated pool. The night was clear, and the sky, even filtered by the city's light pollution, showed some stubborn stars. Richard leaned against the balustrade, looking at the meticulously cared-for garden below. "I want you to know," he began without looking directly at me, "that I'm going to honor our transaction." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "I'm going to pay back your investment with interest. Every cent." "That's not necessary." "It is," he interrupted me, finally turning to face me. "It's absolutely necessary. Not for you, but for me. I need to know that I can get back on my own 2 feet, that I can look my daughter in the eye, and you, without this debt between us." There was a determination in his voice that surprised me. It was no longer the empty arrogance from before, but something more substantial, more genuine. "It will take time," he continued. "I'll have to sell some things, reorganize the company, cut privileges I never really needed, but I'll do it. And when I'm done, when I've paid off my debt to you, maybe we can start over, as 2 men on equal footing." I extended my hand to him, a simple gesture but loaded with meaning. "We already are." He looked at my hand for a moment as if he wasn't sure of the protocol. Then, instead of shaking it, he took a step forward and hugged me briefly, awkwardly, like someone who has forgotten how to express affection without material intermediaries. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not giving up on my daughter even when I gave you every reason to." When we went back inside, Mariana and her mother were waiting for us in the entrance hall. Something had changed in the atmosphere, a dissolved tension, a new beginning possible. We said goodbye without a big fuss. There was no need for elaborate words or grandiose promises. What needed to be said had been, and the rest would come with time. In the Uber back home, Mariana rested her head on my shoulder, the fatigue finally settling over her. The city at night slid by the window, a different New York from the one we had seen on the way there. Or perhaps it was we who were seeing it with different eyes. "Do you think he'll really change?" she asked sleepily. "I don't know," I answered. "Honestly, change is hard, especially after so long. But the first step is to recognize that you need to change." And he did that. She nodded, snuggling closer. "I'm proud of you," she murmured, "for standing up to him, for being exactly who you are." I smiled in the dark, kissing the top of her head. That night didn't just mark the end of my financial support for Richard, nor just the end of my silence in the face of his provocations. It marked the end of a version of myself that had tolerated less than I deserved. As the car approached our neighborhood, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. There were no guarantees that the road ahead would be easy, that Richard would keep his promises, that old dynamics wouldn't try to resurface. But for the first time, I felt that we all, I, Mariana, even Richard and Mrs. Cecilia, were walking towards something more authentic. And that, more than any bank account or mansion on the Upper East Side, was true wealth. When we arrived at our apartment, Mariana was already asleep on my shoulder. I paid the driver and gently carried her upstairs, just as I had on our wedding day. She was light in my arms, but the things we were carrying together, the weight of expectations, judgments, appearances, were finally beginning to lighten. I laid her down on our bed and sat beside her for a moment, watching her serene face in the dark. There, in that small apartment that Richard so despised, there was more peace than in all the empty grandeur of the mansion we had left behind. Tomorrow would be another day. There would be calls to make, conversations to continue, bridges to rebuild. But on that night, in that moment, I had reclaimed something that no money could buy: my dignity. And in doing so, I had perhaps helped Richard find a little of his own too.